December 19, 1944. Stalag 9B, Bad Orb, Germany. The snow fell in silence over the compound, a white shroud over barbed wire and watchtowers. Inside the frozen barracks, newly captured American prisoners of war huddled against the cold, their breath visible in the air like small ghosts. The German guards patrolled with rifles slung over shoulders, their faces carved with the weariness of a war that had turned against them. They had been told these Americans would break easily, soft men from a soft nation, raised on jazz music and Hollywood dreams, unprepared for the brutal realities of total war. The guards remembered the propaganda films, the caricatures of decadent Yankees who couldn't endure hardship. They expected compliance, perhaps even gratitude for not being shot on capture. But as the first formations assembled in the frozen yard that morning, something unexpected emerged. The Americans stood in perfect ranks, shoulders back, eyes forward. Not defiance exactly, but something harder to define, a quiet steel. The first German officer to inspect them paused, his breath catching. He had seen many prisoners. He had never seen this. The prisoners had arrived in waves throughout December, remnants of units shattered during the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's desperate winter offensive had caught American forces off guard in the Ardennes forest, and thousands had been captured in the initial chaos. The Wehrmacht anticipated demoralized troops, men shocked by sudden defeat, ready to collapse under captivity's weight. German intelligence reports painted Americans as individualistic, undisciplined, lacking the collective will that sustained German or Soviet soldiers. Their military, the reports claimed, relied on material superiority rather than martial spirit. Strip away their tanks and aircraft, and what remained? Boys who wanted to go home. Stalag 9B was designed to exploit this perceived weakness. The camp sat in the Hessian hills far from Allied bombing routes. Its commandant, Oberst Werner Müller, was a veteran of the Eastern Front who had managed Soviet prisoners, men he respected for their endurance, if nothing else. He expected the Americans would require different handling, not brutality, but rather a firm paternalism that would break their spirit through isolation and monotony. The Geneva Convention would be observed technically, but interpreted with maximum psychological pressure. Rations would be minimal, mail delayed indefinitely, work assignments harsh, but not quite criminal. The goal was to transform soldiers into statistics, waiting passively for war's end. The camp infrastructure reflected this calculation. Barracks designed for 50 men housed 80. Coal rations were measured to provide heat for only 4 hours daily. The latrines froze regularly. Medical supplies were temporarily unavailable. Guards were instructed to respond to any request with bureaucratic delay, to remind the prisoners constantly that they were forgotten men, abandoned by an army that had moved on without them. The psychological warfare was subtle, but comprehensive. What the Germans did not anticipate was the institutional memory these Americans carried. Many were from units with proud traditions, the 28th Infantry Division, the 106th, the 99th. They had trained for years under officers who had studied the lessons of previous wars. They understood that surrender ended the battle but not the war. Within hours of arrival, senior NCOs were identifying each other through subtle signals, establishing an invisible command structure. By the second day, a secret chain of command existed. By the third, orders were being passed. The Germans saw prisoners adapting to captivity. They did not see an army reconstituting itself behind barbed wire. The first clash came over something trivial: morning formation. Oberst Müller required all prisoners to assemble at 0600 hours for count, standing in irregular groups while guards moved among them with clipboards. It was designed to emphasize their powerlessness, to stand exposed to cold and humiliation, waiting to be numbered like cattle. The Americans had other ideas. On December 23rd, when the guards arrived for morning count, they found the prisoners already assembled in perfect military formation, not the loose crowd of previous days, but precise ranks and files organized by unit and rank. Senior prisoners stood at attention at formation's head. The men were silent, eyes forward, maintaining discipline that would have satisfied any parade ground inspector. The effect was jarring. These were not defeated men waiting to be counted. They were soldiers maintaining unit integrity under adverse conditions. Müller observed from his office window, feeling something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with winter. He had seen this before on the Eastern Front, the way Soviet units maintained cohesion even in captivity, the silent assertion that capture had not erased their identity as soldiers. He had not expected it here. The propaganda had promised him something different. Confused individuals, easily managed through isolation and minor deprivations. Instead, he was looking at organized resistance. The German response was immediate. Guards were ordered to break up the formations, to count prisoners in random order, to prohibit any self-organization. But enforcement proved difficult. The Americans complied with direct orders, while subtly reasserting structure the moment supervision relaxed. They would stand randomly for count, then drift back into formation afterward. They would disperse when commanded, then reform in barracks. The Germans could disrupt the visible order, but they could not eliminate the invisible bonds that sustained it. More disturbing were the small acts of defiance that began appearing. Prisoners saluting each other with exaggerated formality, making the camp feel less like a prison and more like a military base under unusual circumstances. Men marching in step when moving between buildings, turning ordinary movement into demonstration of discipline. The singing. American military songs performed in perfect unison, echoing across the compound. Each act was technically permissible under Geneva Convention, yet each subtly challenged the psychological dominance the Germans sought to establish. The guards felt it, a shift in power dynamics they couldn't quite articulate but definitely sensed. The shock deepened when German guards realized the Americans were enforcing their own discipline more strictly than the Wehrmacht enforced its own. Master Sergeant James Donovan, a career soldier from the 28th Division, had assumed secret command of the American compound. His methods were invisible to German observers, but absolutely clear to the prisoners. Orders passed through whispered conversations, through coded references during mail call, through the arrangement of personal items in barracks that conveyed meaning to those who knew the system. Donovan's first directive addressed cooperation with German authorities. No prisoner would volunteer information beyond name, rank, and serial number. No prisoner would accept special privileges in exchange for cooperation. No prisoner would undermine camp unity for personal advantage. These were not suggestions. They were orders, backed by the same military authority that had governed these men before capture. Violations would be dealt with internally, through social pressure and, if necessary, subtle sanctions that German guards would never witness. The results were remarkable. When Germans attempted to identify prisoners with technical skills for work assignments, they encountered uniform silence. Men with engineering backgrounds claimed to be farm laborers. Radio operators insisted they had been cooks. The Germans could threaten reduced rations, could promise better conditions for cooperation, but the wall of silence held. They tried separating prisoners, offering cigarettes and extra food for simple conversation, but even isolated men maintained discipline. It was as if each prisoner carried an internal commanding officer whose authority exceeded anything the Germans could threaten or promise. More remarkably, the Americans began enforcing standards the Germans had abandoned. Barracks were organized with military precision despite overcrowding. Prisoners maintained personal hygiene despite limited water. They conducted physical training in the frozen yard. Calisthenics performed in organized groups, maintaining fitness and morale simultaneously. The Germans watched with increasing unease. They had expected prisoners to deteriorate, to become listless and manageable. Instead, they were watching an army maintain itself under impossible conditions. Lieutenant Hans Weber, a young guard from Munich, wrote in his diary, "They were supposed to be soft. That's what we were told. Spoiled Americans who couldn't endure hardship. But I watch them in the cold, standing in formation while we ourselves huddle in our coats. I watch them maintain discipline we can barely enforce among our own troops. I begin to wonder what else we were told that wasn't true." The psychological impact on German guards became the unexpected story of Stalag 9B. These were not SS fanatics but Wehrmacht conscripts, many of them veterans invalided from frontline service, others too old or too young for combat duty. They had believed the propaganda because they needed to believe it, that Germany's enemies were inferior, that the war was still winnable, that sacrifice had meaning. The American prisoners challenged these beliefs not through argument, but through silent demonstration. Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann, a 19-year-old guard from Hamburg, had grown up on stories of American weakness. His father had fought in the First World War and spoke contemptuously of Americans who had arrived late to that conflict, fresh and unprepared for war's realities. The propaganda films Zimmermann watched in Hitler Youth reinforced this narrative. Americans as individualistic materialists, lacking the collective spirit necessary for total war. When Zimmermann drew guard duty at the POW camp, He expected to confirm his beliefs. Instead, he found himself guarding men who seemed to possess exactly the qualities German propaganda claimed they lacked. They maintained unit cohesion without visible command structure. They endured hardship without complaint. They enforced discipline through social pressure rather than official authority. Most disturbing to Zimmermann was their quiet confidence, not arrogance, but a fundamental certainty about the war's outcome that no amount of suffering seemed to shake. The cognitive dissonance affected the guards in various ways. Some responded with increased brutality, as if harsh treatment could retroactively validate their preconceptions. Others withdrew into rigid adherence to regulations, maintaining emotional distance from prisoners who confused their worldview. But a growing number began questioning not just the propaganda about Americans, but the broader narrative that sustained their understanding of the war. The camp's medical officer, Dr. Friedrich Hartmann, provided the most penetrating analysis. In his official reports, he noted the prisoners' unexpected resilience and organizational capacity. In his private journal, he wrote more honestly, "We have been told for years that we fight for civilization against degeneracy, that we represent discipline against chaos. But I watch these American prisoners maintain standards of conduct and mutual support that shame our own. They share rations with the sick when we would let them starve. They maintain morale through shared purpose when our own troops require threats to perform basic duties. What does this say about us? What does this say about everything we were told?" As winter deepened into January 1945, a parallel struggle unfolded beyond the camp's barbed wire. German intelligence officers arrived with a different mission: to exploit the prisoners for information and propaganda. The Abwehr had learned from Eastern Front experience that captured soldiers could be valuable sources if properly handled. They came with techniques refined on Soviet prisoners, a combination of pseudo-friendship, ideological argument, and exploitation of prisoner grievances. Their approach with Americans differed from Soviet precedent. Rather than ideological conversion, they sought practical cooperation. Surely some prisoners resented Roosevelt's policies, or felt abandoned by commanders who had led them into the Ardennes disaster. Surely the promise of better treatment, or even early repatriation through peace worker programs, would tempt men who faced indefinite imprisonment. The intelligence officers brought cigarettes, chocolate, and promises. They brought newspapers showing German victories, heavily edited versions of reality designed to convince prisoners the war was far from over. They brought arguments about shared Anglo-Saxon heritage, about the real enemy being Bolshevism rather than Germany. They encountered systematic failure. The American prisoners had been briefed on these techniques before capture. More importantly, their internal command structure had prepared specific responses. When intelligence officers tried to engage prisoners in casual conversation, they received polite silence or responses limited to name, rank, and serial number. When offered special privileges, prisoners declined collectively. To accept would mean betraying the group. When shown propaganda newspapers, prisoners maintained skeptical neutrality that frustrated their interrogators' purposes. The most dramatic failure came with Hauptmann Otto Brecht, an intelligence officer who spoke flawless English and understood American culture through pre-war academic study. He specialized in the slow approach, befriending prisoners through shared interests, building trust over weeks, gradually steering conversations toward useful intelligence. He targeted educated prisoners, officers and NCOs who might have strategic knowledge. He offered books, engaged in philosophical discussions, played chess. Some prisoners accepted these interactions, grateful for intellectual stimulation in the camp's monotony. But Brecht discovered that even prisoners who engaged in friendly conversation maintained operational security with absolute discipline. They would discuss American literature, debate politics in abstract terms, even acknowledge strategic realities, but never confirm German intelligence assumptions, never provide information that could harm Allied operations. Brecht realized he was being professionally handled, that these conversations flowed in only one direction. The Americans were gathering intelligence on German morale while revealing nothing of value. He had become the source, not the prisoners. February 1945 brought a crisis that would define Stalag 9B's character. Rations, already minimal, were reduced further as Germany's collapsing logistics network struggled to supply civilian and military populations. The prisoners' daily bread ration dropped to 200 grams. The thin soup that constituted lunch became thinner. Red Cross parcels, which had provided crucial supplemental nutrition, stopped arriving as transportation networks disintegrated under Allied bombing. Men began losing weight rapidly. Cases of dysentery and pneumonia increased. The camp medical facility, undersupplied even in better times, could offer little beyond sympathy. The Germans expected this deprivation to break prisoner solidarity. Surely hunger would reduce men to individualistic survival, creating competition for limited resources. The camp administration even facilitated this expected breakdown by offering extra rations to work volunteers, creating a deliberate choice between collective loyalty and personal survival. It was a calculated test of American values. Would their individualism overcome their military discipline when stakes became survival itself? The American response stunned German observers. Rather than fragmenting, the prisoners organized a comprehensive mutual support system that would have impressed any logistics officer. The senior NCOs established a distribution network, ensuring that the limited food was shared according to need rather than rank. Healthier prisoners voluntarily reduced their portions so that sick or injured men received adequate nutrition for recovery. The camp's internal economy, based on trading cigarettes and personal items, was regulated to prevent exploitation. Prisoners with medical knowledge provided care to the sick, sharing knowledge and improvising treatments with available materials. Master Sergeant Donovan issued orders that became camp legend. Any prisoner who hoarded food or exploited others for personal advantage would face immediate social ostracism, a punishment that in the camp's closed environment meant complete isolation, potentially life-threatening given the collective nature of survival strategies. Simultaneously, any prisoner who shared his last rations with a sick comrade earned recognition that carried more weight than any medal. The moral economy Donovan established inverted normal survival logic. Generosity became strength, selfishness became weakness. The Germans watched this social organization with growing comprehension. Lieutenant Weber wrote, "They are starving, and yet they maintain discipline we cannot maintain among well-fed troops. They share when we would steal from each other. They protect the weak when we would abandon them. Every day they teach us something about ourselves that we do not wish to learn." March 1945 brought sounds the prisoners had dreamed of. Distant artillery. The Western Front was collapsing. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies approached from the east. Germany was being compressed from all directions, and even in isolated Stalag 9B, the approaching end became audible, a low rumble on the horizon that grew louder each day. The German guards heard it too, and the sound changed everything. Guard discipline deteriorated as Wehrmacht soldiers faced their own crisis of meaning. Some guards became more brutal, as if inflicting suffering could somehow reverse the war's trajectory. Others grew listless, performing duties mechanically while contemplating uncertain futures. A few began treating prisoners with cautious respect, perhaps calculating that American testimony might matter in whatever came after defeat. The camp administration fragmented as officers debated whether to follow Berlin's increasingly deranged orders or preserve their own survival prospects. The prisoners faced their own test. As German control weakened, opportunities for escape multiplied. Guard posts were undermanned. Patrols grew irregular. The perimeter fence, damaged by winter weather and never repaired, offered potential exit points. Individual prisoners could likely escape, especially with spring's arrival making survival in German countryside more feasible. Yet the camp's internal command structure prohibited escape attempts, not from cowardice, but from calculated military judgment. Master Sergeant Donovan explained the logic to assembled NCOs. "We can hear the artillery. Liberation is coming, probably within weeks. Any escape attempt now risks not just the escapees but triggers collective punishment for those remaining. The Germans are desperate and unpredictable. Our duty is to keep our men alive until Allied forces arrive. We've survived this long by maintaining discipline. We don't abandon that discipline in the final stretch." This decision required more moral courage than escape. Every prisoner understood the calculation, but many chafed at passive waiting while freedom approached. The camp's atmosphere grew electric with tension, the proximity of liberation making continued captivity almost unbearable. Yet discipline held. The prisoners maintained their routines, their mutual support systems, their internal command structure. They prepared not for escape, but for orderly transition to Allied authority, maintaining themselves as a military unit ready to return to duty. The German guards noticed this too, the lack of escape attempts despite obvious opportunity. It confirmed what months of observation had taught them. These Americans possessed a collective discipline that transcended individual desire, a quality the guards had been taught was uniquely German. On March 28, 1945, Oberst Müller received orders from Berlin that forced his final confrontation with reality. As Allied forces approached, camps were to evacuate prisoners eastward, deeper into German territory. The goal was to maintain leverage for negotiation, or perhaps to obscure evidence of conditions. The method was forced march. Thousands of prisoners driven on foot across collapsing Germany, guarded by increasingly desperate soldiers, with minimal provisions and no medical support. The Eastern Front camps had conducted similar evacuations with devastating results. Prisoners who couldn't maintain pace were shot. Others died from exposure or disease. Columns disintegrated into chaos. Müller understood what these orders meant: a death march that would kill more prisoners than remained in his camp. He also understood that refusing orders meant court-martial and execution. The SS was shooting officers who showed insufficient zeal in defending the Reich's final weeks. He had served Germany faithfully for 25 years. Now he faced the choice that comes to every soldier in a collapsing regime: follow criminal orders or accept personal destruction. He called a meeting with his senior staff, career officers like himself, men who had believed in military honor even as the regime had perverted it. They discussed options in the camp commandant's office while artillery rumbled closer. Some argued for following orders, citing military duty and fear of SS reprisal. Others argued for delay tactics, stalling until Allied arrival made the orders moot. Dr. Hartmann argued for outright refusal. We have watched these Americans for months. We have learned what military honor actually looks like. Are we now going to murder them because Berlin orders it? The meeting lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Müller had made his decision. He would not order the evacuation. He would claim mechanical problems with transport, communication delays, any bureaucratic excuse that bought time. If pressed, he would refuse outright. He understood this likely meant his death, but watching the American prisoners for 4 months had taught him something: that courage meant maintaining principles when abandoning them would be easier, that discipline meant refusing immoral orders, that honor was more than obedience. He called Master Sergeant Donovan to his office that evening, a meeting that violated every protocol, that could be construed as treason. "They've ordered me to evacuate the camp," Müller said in his careful English. "I'm refusing. Keep your men ready. The Americans will be here soon." The final days of March unfolded in surreal suspension. Müller's refusal to evacuate created bureaucratic confusion that bought crucial time. Berlin sent increasingly frantic orders, but communication networks were fragmenting. SS units that might have enforced the orders were either defending collapsing fronts or fleeing toward Bavaria's rumored Alpine redoubt. The camp existed in administrative limbo, still technically operational, but no longer fully integrated into Wehrmacht command structure. The prisoners sensed the shift immediately. Guards who had maintained hostile distance now treated them with cautious neutrality. Some guards disappeared entirely, deserting into the chaos of Germany's collapse. The remaining Germans performed their duties mechanically, counting prisoners at formations that no longer mattered, guarding perimeters that couldn't contain anyone determined to leave. The power dynamics had inverted completely. The Americans controlled the situation simply by maintaining discipline and waiting. Master Sergeant Donovan used this interregnum to prepare his men for liberation. He established protocols for orderly surrender of the camp to Allied forces, identified senior personnel who would represent the prisoner population, organized documentation of who had died and under what circumstances, compiled evidence of Geneva Convention violations that would matter for post-war accountability. He also established rules for prisoner behavior during the transition: no violence against guards, no looting of camp facilities, no actions that would compromise the orderly transfer of authority. This discipline served multiple purposes. Practically, it ensured liberation proceeded smoothly without the chaos that could provoke violence. Morally, it demonstrated that American military conduct didn't deteriorate when power dynamics shifted. The prisoners had maintained discipline in captivity. They would maintain it in liberation. They would not become what the propaganda had always claimed they were: undisciplined opportunists who respected order only when enforced from above. The German guards observed these preparations with complex emotions: relief that the Americans didn't seek revenge, shame that prisoners maintained better discipline than guards, comprehension that everything they'd been told about American character had been systematically false. Lieutenant Weber spent his off-duty hours writing obsessively in his diary, trying to process the cognitive dissonance. We were told we fought for civilization against barbarism. But which side maintained civilized conduct when power shifted? Which side honored agreements? Which side protected the vulnerable? I no longer know what I fought for, but I know what I'm witnessing now, and it's not what the propaganda promised. April 2nd, 1945. Dawn broke over Stalag 9B to reveal American tanks on the horizon. The 6th Armored Division, part of Patton's 3rd Army, had advanced faster than intelligence predicted, sweeping across the Hessian hills in a rapid drive that left isolated Wehrmacht units surrounded and bypassed. The camp's guards saw the tanks first, Sherman silhouettes cresting the hills to the west, sunlight gleaming off metal hulls, accompanied by mechanized infantry that moved with terrifying efficiency. Oberst Müller made his final decision as commandant. He ordered white flags raised, commanded all guards to assemble without weapons in the parade ground, and sent a runner under truce flag to the approaching Americans with a simple message. The camp surrendered unconditionally. There would be no resistance, no final pointless fight. His guards, exhausted teenagers and invalided veterans, obeyed with visible relief. They stood in formation as American armored vehicles surrounded the camp, as infantry deployed with weapons ready, as officers approached to accept the surrender. The liberating Americans expected chaos, diseased prisoners, brutal guards, evidence of atrocities that had characterized camps liberated further east. Instead, they found something unprecedented, a camp operating under military discipline from both sides. The prisoners were assembled in proper formation, clearly organized and prepared for orderly liberation. The German guards stood in unarmed formation, waiting to be processed as prisoners themselves. Müller met the American commander with full documentation, prisoner rosters, death certificates, supply records, evidence he had maintained Geneva Convention standards as far as collapsing infrastructure allowed. Captain James Morrison, commanding the liberating force, had fought across France and Germany. He had seen camps where prisoners were starving skeletons, where German personnel had fled or destroyed evidence, where liberation meant medical emergency and criminal investigation. Stalag 9B was different. The prisoners were gaunt but functioning, organized but not cowed. The guards were defeated but not desperate. Most remarkably, when Morrison asked Master Sergeant Donovan for his assessment, Donovan provided a military report rather than accusations. Number of prisoners, casualties sustained, condition of supplies, security status. Morrison later wrote in his after-action report, expected to liberate victims, found soldiers who had liberated themselves spiritually, even while remaining physically captive. The Germans held their bodies, but never broke their discipline. Most remarkable, the prisoners requested no revenge on guards, only requested proper military processing and documentation for post-war accountability. These men never stopped being soldiers. The transition from captivity to liberation revealed the full measure of what the prisoners had maintained. As American medical personnel examined the former captives, they documented weight loss, disease symptoms, and malnutrition effects, standard consequences of POW life. But they also documented something less tangible, psychological resilience that defied conventional expectations. These men had endured months of captivity, had watched comrades die from disease and deprivation, had faced daily humiliation and uncertainty. Standard psychological models predicted trauma, depression, breakdown of social cohesion. Instead, medical officers found men who maintained unit identity, who supported each other through transition, who processed liberation as a military operation rather than personal salvation. The prisoners' own accounts emphasized the collective nature of survival. In debriefing sessions, they credited their survival, not to individual fortitude, but to the discipline that Master Sergeant Donovan and other NCOs had enforced. They described the mutual support systems, the sharing of rations, the maintenance of morale through shared purpose. They emphasized that survival had required subordinating individual desires to collective need, precisely the opposite of the individualistic weakness German propaganda had attributed to Americans. The German guards, now prisoners themselves, provided equally revealing testimony. In interrogations, they described their growing shock as American prisoners demonstrated discipline the Wehrmacht could barely maintain. They explained how propaganda had promised them soft enemies easily managed, and how reality had systematically destroyed these illusions. Some expressed shame that prisoners under their authority had maintained higher standards than they themselves observed. Others retreated into ideological denial, insisting the Americans were exceptional rather than representative, but most acknowledged the fundamental lesson. They had believed their own propaganda, and reality had proven it catastrophically false. Oberst Müller's interrogation proved most significant. American intelligence officers initially treated him with suspicion. Commandants of POW camps were potentially war criminals. But prisoner testimony supported Müller's claim that he had maintained acceptable conditions within his capacity and had ultimately defied Berlin's evacuation orders to protect prisoners. More importantly, Müller provided detailed testimony about how German military leadership had systematically misunderstood American military culture, creating intelligence failures that had strategic consequences. He described how propaganda-based assumptions had led Wehrmacht planners to underestimate American military effectiveness, contributing to strategic decisions that hastened Germany's defeat. The Americans at Stalag 9B had been microcosm of a larger pattern, consistent German failure to understand their enemy. The true revelation came not in the moment of liberation, but in the weeks afterward, as historians and journalists began documenting what had occurred at Stalag 9B. The story became symbolic of something larger than one camp's experience. It illuminated the bankruptcy of the entire ideological framework that had sustained the German war effort. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda had constructed an elaborate mythology about racial hierarchies, about German superiority and enemy degeneracy, about the spiritual qualities that would ensure German victory despite material disadvantages. The mythology claimed Germans possessed unique capacity for discipline, sacrifice, and collective purpose, qualities lacking in individualistic democracies like America. Stalag 9B demonstrated the mythology's complete inversion of reality. The American prisoners, drawn from a society Nazi ideology dismissed as decadent and individualistic, had maintained collective discipline and mutual support under conditions that tested these qualities to their limits. They had enforced standards of conduct without formal authority, had subordinated individual survival to collective welfare, had preserved unit cohesion through shared purpose rather than coercion. They had embodied precisely the virtues Nazi ideology claimed were uniquely German, and had done so more completely than their captors. The German guards had believed the propaganda because believing it gave meaning to their suffering, justified their sacrifices, explained their losses. Confronting Americans who contradicted every propaganda claim forced a reckoning more painful than physical defeat. It meant acknowledging that the war had been based on systematic self-deception, that the ideology justifying German aggression had been false from its foundations. The guards at Stalag 9B had received a concentrated dose of this revelation, months of daily contact with prisoners who silently refuted everything they'd been told. The psychological impact extended beyond individual Germans. Stalag 9B became a case study in post-war analysis of how democracies had defeated fascism not despite their values, but because of them. The mutual support, voluntary discipline, and shared purpose that sustained the American prisoners reflected deeper social capacities that totalitarian systems could only simulate through coercion. The guards had expected prisoners dependent on authority to maintain order. They found instead men who maintained order through internal commitment to shared principles. This capacity, to organize collective action through voluntary cooperation rather than imposed hierarchy, was precisely what had enabled American military effectiveness and ultimately guaranteed Allied victory. 70 years later, historians still study Stalag 9B as exemplar of a truth totalitarian systems consistently fail to grasp. Free societies under pressure often exceed authoritarian societies in the very qualities authoritarians claim as unique virtues. The American prisoners survived not through exceptional individual heroism, but through collective discipline that emerged from shared values rather than imposed authority. They maintained humanity in conditions designed to destroy it, not because military regulations required mutual support, but because their culture had internalized principles of mutual obligation that survived captivity's pressures. They embodied democratic strength that totalitarian ideology cannot comprehend, the capacity for self-organization, voluntary sacrifice, and maintained principle without external enforcement. Master Sergeant Donovan returned to civilian life in Philadelphia, working construction and raising a family. He rarely discussed his POW experience, but when pressed, he emphasized the collective nature of survival. We were just soldiers doing our jobs. The remarkable thing wasn't any individual. It was that we maintained ourselves as a unit, even when we had no official authority to enforce it. That's what being American soldiers meant. Not toughness or heroism, but commitment to each other and to standards we'd internalized. Oberst Miller survived the war and provided extensive testimony about German military intelligence failures. His analysis influenced post-war strategic thinking about the danger of ideology-based intelligence assessment. He spent his final years teaching history in Heidelberg, emphasizing to students that propaganda's greatest victims are those who believe it. The Americans at my camp taught me more about military virtue than 25 years in the Wehrmacht, he wrote in his memoir. They taught me by example what I should have known from principle, that human dignity and collective purpose don't depend on race or ideology, but on commitment to values that transcend individual survival. The lesson endures. When societies convince themselves that their enemies are weak, degenerate, or lacking in essential human qualities, they create strategic vulnerabilities that reality will exploit. The guards at Stalag 9B expected soft Americans and found soldiers. Germany expected easy victory and found defeat. The cost of ideological blindness was a war that destroyed Europe and killed millions. They thought Americans were soft. They learned otherwise, but the lesson came too late to save them from the consequences of their delusion. Some wisdom can only be purchased through suffering. The guards at Stalag 9B paid that price, and their testament remains. Never believe your own propaganda, especially about your enemies.